By the time the sun cleared the ridge, Caleb and Drew were already 2 miles from the trailhead, packs riding high and the world narrowing to boot falls, bird song, and the dull roar of water somewhere ahead. The air smelled like crushed fur and cold stone. A web of blue creeks threaded from snowfields higher up, merging into a single voice: the river. 3 nights, Drew said, shifting his fly rod tube from one shoulder to the other. 0 signal. I plan to come back a better man. You just want to come back with a fish bigger than your head, Caleb said. That too, Drew grinned. And we're eating at least one. Caleb ducked under a windfall, smiled despite the weight on his hips. They hadn't done a real trip in years. College, jobs, then the slow erosion of free time. But this stretch of water drew them both on maps and satellite tiles. Miles from the nearest road, nothing but old timber and the long green snake of wilderness around a river that curled like a question mark. They crossed a log bridge slick with moss and followed the trail down into a notch. The river suddenly appeared, steel blue, gliding between boulders the size of cars, with glassy tailouts and riffles stitched white. Trout slid up from the seam and kissed the surface, their rings spreading outward. Drew let out a long whistle. Tell me you see that, Selim. Tell me you see that. I see it, Caleb said. And I see camp. That flat spot on the inside bend, out of the wind, close to water. They dropped packs in the grass and stood for a second in that old silence before work. Then they fell into their familiar rhythm. Tent up, stakes in, bare hang line over a branch. Caleb found a fire ring half swallowed by ferns, rebuilt it with new stones. Drew filtered water until his hands were cold. At lunch, they sat on a log with tortillas and peanut butter. The river made a sound that never repeated itself. A jay scolded them, an indignant aristocrat. You remember the stories my granddad used to tell about places like this? Caleb said, wiping his knife. Something about the walker? Drew wiggled his fingers like a child telling a ghost tale. I remember the punchline. Don't whistle. Don't say its name. Don't look at it too long. Don't let it hear your true voice, Caleb said. He didn't mean for the words to come out so flat, he shrugged. Country superstition. I'm of the firm opinion that my opinion is firm. I don't believe in anything I can't outwalk. Drew stood, stretched. Come on, evening hatch is going to be stupid. They went light, waders, vests, rod tubes in hand. By 3, they were thigh-deep in the river. Midges drifted over the water in a haze. The air smelled like wet stone. Caleb tied a parachute Adams to 5X, trimmed the tag end, and dropped the fly just upstream from a submerged rock. It rode down the slick seam and disappeared as if the river breathed it in. He lifted and felt the sudden crisp weight of a fish. Fish, he called, and the river answered with a flash. The trout was bronze and green and speckled, freckled with galaxies. It ran to the current, cartwheeled, and came to the net with a final twist, as alive as a handful of heartbeat. They admired it. Old ritual, then released it back to the cold. Okay, Drew said. Now I believe in something. They fished until the light softened and the river yielded more rings than a tossed pebble could explain. At camp, Drew built a small fire and cooked a single trout on a grate with lemon and butter he'd smuggled in a cold bag. Confession, he said, flipping the fish carefully. I inspected my soul just now and found a trout-shaped hole. Just one, Caleb said. Catch and release tomorrow. We leave it better than we found it. Scout's honor. Night came in layers. First the shadows between trees deepened, then the sky turned indigo, and then the world seemed to shrink to a soft crater of orange where their fire lived. Somewhere high in the first, needles ticked like rain without rain. The river was a long whisper pressed to their ears. They talked about nothing and everything. High school dumbness, jobs they almost took. The girl Drew was seeing who could read 2 books in a weekend and still make time for a 6-mile run. When they crawled into their sleeping bags, Caleb listened to the river until it folded itself into dreams. Sometime in the night, he woke. Not from cold or discomfort, but from silence. The river's whisper was still there, but the ambient hum of the forest had thinned until it felt like a held breath. Drew's sleep was a steady coast at his left, a slow in and out. Then a whistle lifted from the trees across the river. Not bird song, too exact, too human, and it rose on 3 notes like someone calling a dog. Caleb propped himself on an elbow. The whistle came again, nearer, then farther, like something practicing distance. "Drew," he whispered. Drew made a noise in his throat and rolled onto his back. The whistle slid through the trees a third time, this one longer, as if tasting how long it could last without breaking. "Probably some hiker," Drew muttered, not opening his eyes. "At 1 in the morning?" "Lost hiker," Drew said, and then he slept again, as if the matter were settled. Caleb lay awake, counting the space between whistles. He didn't sleep until the birds came back, and when they did, they came all at once. Morning rebuilt the world with dew. Drew yawned his way into boots and went to the river with a mug for coffee water. Caleb rummaged for his small fixed blade, habit, borrowed from his grandfather, first morning sharpening for calm hands. He patted one pocket, then another. He emptied the top of the duffel. "You see my knife?" he called. "Which one?" Drew said, crouched by the water. "The one with the micarta handle, lanyard hole." Drew walked back, steam lifting from the mug. "You had it last night when you did the lemon." "I know," Caleb said. He checked in places that didn't make sense. Under the inflatable pad, beneath the stove. He found it an hour later, tucked into the fork of a sapling, 30 feet from camp, blade driven clean through the bark. The lanyard was tied in a complicated knot he didn't recognize. He'd brought it back. "Funny," he said, holding it so the light slid along the edge. "You?" Drew made a face. "Pranks are a young man's game, and I like my arteries unmolested. That knot, though, that you?" Caleb shook his head. They exchanged the look friends get when they're balancing between an easy explanation and something heavier. Caleb didn't say the knot felt like a signature. They fished. The river was generous, perhaps to apologize for the whistle. 3 times Drew whooped with the loud, clean joy of a good cast mended well, a take you earned. Caleb tried to let the knot drain out of him back into the water, but sometimes he would look at the opposite bank and imagine someone standing there, still as a burned stump, watching. At lunch, a wind came up from down canyon, cold enough to carry the taste of snow, and with it a smell like wet dog left too long in a closed-up car. Drew waved a hand in front of his face. "Oh man," he said, "that's vintage." Caleb sniffed. "Not skunk, not wolf, something meat-sweet and spoiled." "Bear?" Drew said. "Maybe," Caleb said, though he had never smelled a bear stink like that. They were up the side channel when it happened, Caleb knee-deep, working an eddy seam. Drew 30 yards upstream behind a screen of alder. The river thinned itself into song. A mayfly landed on Caleb's sleeve, pale wings tented like a little cathedral. "Caleb," Drew called from behind the trees. "Hey, you gotta see this!" Caleb looked over his shoulder, but he couldn't see him, only the quiver of leaves. "What is it?" "Come here." The voice was right but wrong, the exact right texture of Drew's vowels but at the wrong distance, as if the sound were stepping forward and backward at the same time. "Caleb," the voice said again, closer now, as if just behind the alders. "Hurry." He felt his scalp go tight. He started wading that direction, and then the real Drew came battering down the rocks from upstream, breathless, hat crooked. "Dude," Drew said, "you see the size of the fish cruising below that log?" "Caleb?" Caleb's breath went out of him all at once. He looked from Drew to the screen of alder and said, You were just—" "What?" Drew said. Something moved behind the alders, a quick slither of shade, and then the smell came back, riding a little eddy of wind, wet dog, and old pennies. They didn't fish that stretch anymore that day. They ate early, both pretending to be hungrier than they were. When dusk fell, it fell fast. Around the fire, Caleb found himself telling his grandfather's version of the story, the one with specific rules. "Don't whistle after dark," he said, and tried to make it a joke. "Don't answer if you hear your name from the trees. Don't say its name." "But we are very much saying its name," Drew said softly. "Only as a story," Caleb said. They let the fire coals sink into themselves. After they crawled into the tent, the same hush unspooled from the forest. The river kept speaking, but everything else seemed to step politely out of the room. Sometime after midnight, something walked around the tent. Not a bear. Too light. Not a person. The spacing of the steps was just a little off, as if weight were testing different arrangements. It stopped near the door and breathed in once, like someone smelling soup. Caleb lay rigid with the particular paralysis of prey. His hand found Drew's forearm in the dark. Drew's skin was cold. They waited. The steps went on, a ring of quiet interrupted by careful trotting. After a while, the breathing moved away. Before dawn, a whistle came from the river. 3 notes, slurred like someone still learning. In the gray morning, one of Drew's boots was gone. They found it later that day at the edge of a gravel bar half a mile downstream, standing upright, laces tied in the same unfamiliar knot. In its toe was a pebble shaped like a tooth. "What is this?" Drew said, half laughing, half not. "We have a raccoon Boy Scout messing with us." Caleb was kneeling by the boot. The knot made his skin crawl. "Or someone is trying to talk." "Talk how? In knots?" "Some cultures leave sign," Caleb said. "Bundles, shapes, warnings." "You're not doing the thing where you convince me it's a message and then we die in Act 3, Drew said. "Untie it. We're going to the truck. We can come back with more people. Or at least bear spray and our big boy pants." Caleb undid the knot. The lace left a pattern on his fingers. They shouldered packs and took just what they needed. The trail climbed in switchbacks through fear and then through younger trees bent by old snow loads. The day warmed as if nothing cared about rules, and the river noise fell behind them until it became a memory of noise. At the ridgeline, the fog found them. It swelled up from the low country like a muscle and filled the forest one room at a time. By the time they realized how fast it was moving, they could barely see the tips of their boots. "This is dumb," Drew said. "We sit. We don't wander circles." They waited 2 hours. The fog thickened. It held smells like a hand, the sour stink, the metallic edge of wet stone. When they finally stood, the trees were closer to them than they'd expected, as if they'd walked in their sleep. "We go back down," Caleb said. "We have shelter, food." "Shelter and food in our new neighbor," Drew said, listening. The world inside the fog had different acoustics. A branch falling sounded like an argument in another house. Somewhere, water dripped in a way that suggested footsteps. They walked more by memory than sight. When they found the river, they found it by noise, first the faint idea of it, then the textured sound of it, then at last the white slick of moving water appearing from gray. They followed that ribbon back to camp. Fog held the camp in a bowl. It stripped day of distance and turned every small sound up one notch. A zipper, a spoon in a pot, the slow, ghostly clap of something heavy, far off. They tried to keep a routine. Coffee, oatmeal, the delicate industry of tying new leaders. Drew's hands shook just enough to make knots extravagant. "I'm going to say something," he said finally. "It's stupid, but I'm going to say it. We should not say each other's names, not today." "Deal," Caleb said quietly. "Also," Drew said, "we should stop talking about leaving. I think something likes that idea." They didn't fish. They stayed near the tent and watched the fog move the way you watch a sleeping animal breathe. Shapes came and faded. A tree, a boulder, the suggestion of a person too tall. At noon, Drew tried the little AM/FM radio he carried like a talisman. Static, then a voice that was not a voice. A watery sound that could have been speech 2 rooms away. Drew shut it off. Nope. Twice, they saw a figure between the trees. Both times it stood just wrong, poised like a deer, tall like a man, shoulders too narrow or too wide depending on how the fog dragged at the edges. Once it lifted a hand. It might have been a branch. It might have been saying hello. The smell came and went. When it came, birds vanished. When it left, a single fly would bump against the tent and remind them there was a world with flies in it. "What if we ask it to stop?" Drew said, voice small, not joking. "Asking is acknowledging," Caleb said, and hated that he sounded like his grandfather. That night, after a long spiraling of hours, the fog brightened, then dimmed, then brightened. Useless moonlight turned into a lamp behind a sheet. They lay there and waited for sleep like a bus that didn't come. Caleb woke to a zipper inching open. The tent door nudged, just an inch, then 2. He felt the cold air on his face and sat up without thinking, hand out in the dark. The headlamp was beside his sleeping bag. He didn't turn it on. In the triangular blackness of the half-open flap, a figure crouched. It filled the small void like smoke. It had a face, maybe, but the face arranged itself into shapes faster than his mind could give them names. Eye, mouth, fur. A smile that was not kindness. It breathed. The breath came in and out carefully, as if practicing. Caleb reached sideways and found Drew's shoulder. Drew didn't stir. The figure leaned closer. Caleb smelled old pennies and a wet dog left in the sun. "Hey," said the figure, and it was Drew's voice exactly. Then, "Hey, Caleb," the second time. The voice bent the syllables a little, as if tasting how they fit. Something in Caleb's spine stood up. Without thinking, he put his palm flat against the figure's chest and pushed. It moved, too quickly, too light, and the tent door flapped closed as if wind had done it. Drew woke. What? Nothing, Caleb said too quickly. Dream. They lay still until morning had the courage to be morning. When the fog lifted a little, they found new things. On the log near the fire pit, a stack of pebbles arranged from smallest to largest, 7 stones, each with a black dot on it, as if marked with a fingertip dipped in swamp. At the base of a fir, the missing lemon, in the dirt, its rind carved with a shape that could have been a face if you wanted it to be. And in the crook of a branch 5 feet off the ground, tied with familiar knots, hung Drew's bootlace, looped and hitched like a sentence. "This is theater," Drew said. He was trying to be angry and make it loud enough to fill his chest. "This is somebody." "Somebody who can move at night without a sound," Caleb said. "And who knows our names?" "People know each other's names," Drew snapped. "People learn. People stalk. People do weird things in the woods." Caleb didn't argue. A rabbit exploded from the ferns and ran in a wide circle, mouth open like a scream with no noise in it, then vanished. They both flinched as if the thing had run through them. There were tracks around camp that weren't theirs. Long, almost deer-like, but the toes splayed in a way that suggested a hand. The longer you looked, the less you understood. They burned the lemon without discussing why. Late afternoon went thin. The fog banked in the bends of the river like pooled milk. Caleb and Drew stood on the gravel bar with their backs to the camp because it felt better to look outward than inward. Across the river, between willows, a figure stood. It was as pale as the fog and as still as a stump. It had the outline of a person but was taller and too lean, joints splinted wrong. It turned its head in that narrow, studying way deer have. Jerk, pause, jerk, as if calibrating. Drew lifted his hand in a gesture that was not a wave and not surrender. "Hey," he said, before he remembered not to speak the way he'd speak to a person. The figure didn't answer. It stepped backward. It seemed to fold itself into a wrong angle, and then it was gone, except that the smell arrived on the water like anything riding a cold current. "Stay," Caleb said, to no one in particular. They turned on their headlamps at dusk. Light in fog makes distance a private joke. Your beam returns to you with dust and water in it, showing you only how alone you are. Still, they thought it might anchor them. When the first scream came, high, strangled, something between a rabbit and a woman, they both ran toward it because that's what people do. The scream happened again, farther, then closer to their left. They pivoted, crashed through brush, hit river, splashed, stopped. The scream ran around them in a wide, delighted circle. "Stop," Caleb said, dragging Drew back by the sleeve. "It's playing." They backed to the gravel bar and stood shoulder to shoulder. That was when the rocks started to come from the trees. Small at first, pebbles that pattered at their feet, then larger. One struck Caleb's shoulder, a neat hard knock that made him grunt. "Okay," Drew said between his teeth. "Okay." They retreated to camp, backs prickling. The rocks followed, as if someone were throwing while walking backward. The tent waited for them like a promise. They didn't sleep. The second day of fog pressed them thin. Food got smaller. Packets split in half, instant coffee rationed by memory. They tried to joke because they were good at that. "Would you rather fight 1 moose-sized trout or 100 trout-sized moose?" Drew said, and his voice cracked at the end. "Moose-sized trout," Caleb said automatically. "Think of the fillets." "Catch and release," Drew whispered. They kept busy in loops. Tidy gear, sweep ash, check the bear hang, retie knots. In between, the world made its new noises. Once they heard footsteps in the river, careful and deliberate, like someone wading without knowing what water is. Once they heard singing, the haunted tuneless singing of someone trying to find a melody from a different culture. At noon, the tent shook. Not from wind, from something that set its hands, pause, on the poles and pressed. The fabric bowed in and then bowed out, and each motion was tender, inquisitive, as if testing elasticity. "Please stop," Drew said, and put his hand against the place where the pressure was. The pressure withdrew like a disappointed friend. After a minute, the zipper moved half an inch down and then up. They spent the afternoon with knives out on their knees. They weren't sure what they would do with them. Sharp steel is a human thought, and this didn't feel like a human problem. Toward evening, Caleb took his phone out and opened the voice memo app and set it on record, face down on the log, because doing nothing felt worse than the alternative. He did not say what he hoped it would catch. That night, a new voice spoke from the trees, his own, saying his mother's name. It reached inside him and pressed buttons he didn't know he still had. He stood up. Drew grabbed his wrist. "No," Drew said, voice fierce. "We don't go when we're called." Caleb sat down again without remembering the part in between. He woke to someone whispering in his ear. It was his voice. It was Drew's voice. It was his grandfather's voice. The words themselves were not words. They were shapes of words, empty molds. He rolled over and found Drew sitting upright, eyes open, not seeing. "Hey," Caleb whispered. "We're in the tent, you're okay." Drew blinked again, then shuddered like someone coming up from a deep pool. "I dreamed." "No, not a dream." It was standing in the river up to its hips, facing upstream, and the water went around it like it wasn't there. "Stop," Caleb said softly. Drew swallowed. "It had my face on wrong." They lay in the dark and kept their breaths small. At dawn, the fog thinned suddenly, torn from above. They saw blue through the rents. The birds came back, tentative, as if asking permission. Downriver, a breeze rucked the mist like a rug someone was shaking. "Go," Caleb said. They shouldered their packs before the sentence finished. They left the pebbles unknocked, the tent poles uncollapsed. They left the lemon ash and the old knot of laces hanging like punctuation they refused to read. They climbed without talking. Fog still lay in quiet bars across the trail, but the sun burned edges away. They moved fast, legs remembering old strength. Twice a shape moved through the trees parallel to them, one ridge over, a stuttering pail that kept pace and then backed off. "Don't look at it," Caleb said, and then didn't know why he'd said it aloud. Halfway to the trailhead, the wind came up. It smelled like a new page, dry, clean. The stink vanished as if it had folded itself into a crevice and closed the lid. They reached the trailhead by mid-afternoon, where their truck waited under pollen-dusted alder. The sight of it made Caleb's knees big with relief. Drew dug for the keys, pressed the unlock fob, and nothing happened. He frowned, put the key in the door, opened it, slid in. He turned the ignition. The starter clicked once, thin, embarrassed, then nothing. "No," Drew said softly, as if the truck could be gently argued into usefulness. He tried again, the same single click. The air inside the cab smelled like stale coffee and chewing gum, and under that, for a split second, wet dog. Caleb set his pack down. "We give it a minute," he said, and then, because he couldn't bear to sit still, "Pop the hood." Drew popped it. They both leaned into the engine bay as if understanding would come with posture. Everything looked fine. Nothing looked fine. Caleb touched the battery cables just to touch something. They gave it 5 minutes, then 10. The truck started on the 11th minute like it was always going to. The engine caught, coughed, settled. "Okay," Drew said, voice shaking. "Okay, we're going." They pulled onto the dirt road. Dust rose in the mirror like a ghost trying to keep up. Neither of them looked back. At the first paved intersection, Drew slowed just enough for the tires to talk to the new surface. Wind moved through the cab. Birds and sun and the ordinary human world poured into them like medicine. Caleb reached to adjust the rearview mirror and saw something white caught under the windshield wiper blade. He tapped the dash. "Stop." Drew pulled over onto the shoulder. A semi swept by in a gust. Caleb got out and lifted the wiper. There, looped just so, was Drew's bootlace, tied with the same knot as before. It held a single trout scale, dried iridescent, that spun in the breeze like a coin deciding. Caleb said nothing. He held the lace out to Drew. Drew stared at it as if it were a photograph of himself at a party he never attended. "It wants us to know it can go where we go," he said finally. Caleb placed the lace in the glove box and closed it. "It wants us to know we took something from it," he said, "and it took something back." They drove without the radio. The hum of tires on asphalt sounded like a river trying to remember words. At home, everything looked wrong by being right. The color temperature of the grocery store made their eyes ache. The barista asked for a name for the cups, and Caleb almost said, "No names," before he heard himself. Drew's apartment smelled like eucalyptus from the plant his girlfriend insisted would help with his allergies. He set his pack on the floor in the hall and stood in the doorway as if he were about to flee. "You sleeping here tonight?" Caleb asked. If I sleep, I'm sleeping where there are neighbors, Drew said, and tried a grin that didn't make it to his eyes. You can crash on the couch. Two-man paranoia tent. They ate takeout and didn't talk about the river. Night poured over the city in the usual way. The dark here was not a dark with rules, just absence of light. Their windows reflected their faces back when they looked out. Around 2, a whistle drifted up from the alley. 3 notes, exact as before but softer, like someone practicing under a blanket. Drew sat up on the couch, pulse in his jaw. Caleb swung his legs to the floor and said quietly, "No." They didn't look out. The whistle came again, then stopped. A raccoon tipped over the recycling bin. A siren wrote a blue syntax across the wall and went away. The day after, Caleb remembered the voice memo sitting face down on the log. He'd picked up his phone on autopilot when they'd left and never thought of it again. He opened the app with the small dread you get when you suspect a photo is going to show you more than you saw. The file was there, 17 hours. He put on headphones, pressed play, and heard the usual nonsense of camp life. The scrape of a spoon in a pot, the low talk of 2 men trying to be quiet, the river's versions of itself. At 1 hour and 12 minutes, a voice came in. Delicate at first, like something exploring language. It said his name wrong, and then right, and then wrong again, trying vowels, trying length. It imitated Drew saying an ordinary sentence, "Hand me the lighter," but it put the stress in the wrong place, making the words into something that felt like a question. At 3 hours, a new voice began. Familiar and not. His grandfather, dead now, telling him one of the old warnings. It wasn't a recording he recognized. It was a performance from memory, gaps filled with shapes of words, meaning leaking. At 6 hours, the singing came in, something tuneless and patient. It fell in and out of the river, like someone walking through your house thinking it's theirs. Caleb took the headphones off. He didn't delete the file. He didn't send it to Drew. He placed the phone face down on the table and put his palms on either side of it and leaned there until the pressure of his own hands returned him to his body. People asked how the trip went. He said, "Good water. Big fish. A storm sat on them for a day." He said, "Too much fog, no pictures." He said, "Next time farther upriver." At night, sometimes, he woke to the thought that words were doors. He wondered which sentences had opened what. Don't whistle after dark. Don't answer if you hear your name. Don't say its name. It felt too late to be careful with language. The knots had already been tied. He found he avoided mirrors in mornings. He caught himself standing just to the side when he brushed his teeth, as if expecting to see his face slide into alignment late. At the grocery store, the smell of a wet dog turned his stomach so quickly he abandoned his cart and went outside and let traffic noise wash him blank. Drew texted him a picture of the bootlace in the glove box lying on registration papers like a dead snake. Beneath it, the single trout scale still held a suggestion of rainbow. "Why keep it?" Caleb wrote. "Because throwing it away is letting it do the throwing," Drew wrote back. "Then, you keeping the file?" Caleb didn't reply. The little dots blinked on Drew's end, blinked off. When sleep came, it came like falling through branches. In one dream, Caleb was on the gravel bar alone. Fog lapped at his knees like old cats. Across the river, a shape lifted its hand and touched its face as if checking to see which one it was wearing. It opened its mouth and poured out a sound like water running backward. He woke with his jaw sore from gritting. In another, he was waist deep in the river at night. The stars were low and wrong. The thing stood to his left and leaned shoulder to shoulder with him like a friend. "Think of the fillets," it said in Drew's voice, and then again with all stress removed. "Think of the fillets." He woke and went to the kitchen and drank water that tasted like tin until the sky was gray. Once he dreamed of knots, endless knots, lanyards tied in patterns that conveyed grammar he could almost read. He woke with his fingers curled as if holding a lace and couldn't unclench them for a long minute.